Thank you all for coming to day 3 of Transfer Transitions. To kick off on student wellness, we're going to be having a workshop on how to deal with coping with COVID is what it's called, but essentially it's kind of like dealing with a lot of the stressors that 2020 has kind of wrought with us. And here with us today is Dr. Andrea Letamendi. She's going to be hosting a presentation on COVID. So if you'd like to take it away, Dr. Letamendi, she's from the Rise Center and she's been really wonderful. So take it away.
Thank you, Vicente. Good morning, everybody. I'm about to share my screen in a moment. I do have some slides that I'd love to share with you as I talk about this topic. The first thing I just want to say is I appreciate the warm welcome. I am very appreciative and grateful to be invited into your space to have this conversation with your community. And I also very much appreciate that we started talking about Star Wars and there was a little engagement there. So I just am truly grateful to have this conversation. Before I share my slides, I do want to say a couple things. One, I appreciate the engagement, and that can happen in a variety of ways, whether we're chatting in the chat box or people are unmuting themselves and asking questions. And you'll notice that we have moderators here during breakouts to hold some dialogue for some of the deeper questions that maybe we want to give people an opportunity to engage in a smaller group. So we've sort of designed various ways to engage with one another around this really important topic. The other piece is that I couldn't, through the last 6 months, I'd say one of my specialty areas is around anxiety and stress management. And as COVID pervaded our lives, I couldn't talk about COVID without talking about the social lens of COVID, how COVID is not just impacting our biological lens, but also impacts our identity, cultural, societal lens as well. And so I felt it was important to kind of bring some of these ideas together as we talk about your journeys in your experience here in higher education. So the reason why this workshop is designed the way it is to really kind of uplift our experiences within the social lens and really amplify and understand that COVID is impacting us all in different ways. One way that we might share the experience is that we're in higher education, whether we're staff or faculty in higher education, whether we're grad students, transfer students, and new Bruins. And so I think there might be some shared cultural experiences here that people may feel connected to, but there are also some experiences that you might have not related to that identity, like in your familial or neighborhood or community. And so I want to address that these are also fluid identities and fluid experiences. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And making sure folks can see this. You're good, awesome. So if you're here to talk about conquering stress in 2020, then you're in the right place. If you're not in the right place, stick around. We're going to talk about some strategies and tips that might be helpful for you in kind of managing not just COVID, as I mentioned, but what I'm sort of calling, the stressors of 2020, the intersections of the pandemic, racial unrest, racial trauma, and tensions around the upcoming election. And hopefully what I can implore folks to consider is how you might be positioning yourself in your educational journey and how this might be an opportunity for growth, as well as an opportunity to learn some strategies as you're managing these various social threats. Again, thanks for having me here. I just want to give a brief introduction for folks who may not have met me before. My name is Drea Letamendi. I go by Drea. I'm a clinical psychologist, received my PhD from UCSD and did my postdoctoral position at UCLA. I'm currently the interim director of the Student Resilience Center known as RISE. RISE is a hub that is affiliated with CAPS, our Counseling and Psychological Services at UCLA. I also hold a position in residential life, which is how I started in student affairs. at UCLA. I'm the Associate Director of Mental Health Training, Intervention, and Response for Residential Life. And then, I also just want to point out, I identify as a Latinx psychologist. I think it's important to sort of position myself in that way. What does that mean as a woman of color, as professional staff in student affairs, and as a person who's managing leadership during COVID? Those various identities and various roles have introduced challenges and as well as opportunities for me that impact the way that I'm seeing this experience. So just a quick, I'm not going to read this through, but I do want to address that we're here to talk about good psychological health. And I want to sort of destigmatize or take away the pathology of this understanding that maybe if you're working on your psychological health, there's something wrong with you. I kind of want to twist that around and address or position us around the lens that actually every day we should be working on our psychological health, especially now that COVID is in our lives every day in some way or another. So we're going to talk first about just let's just frame this around stress. If you've taken trainings with me or you work with me, my style is to be as direct as possible. I just want to bring the realness because especially now we're seeing this dynamic of business as usual, move forward, go forth. And I think sometimes we don't take a pause and reflect on the realness of our experiences, especially at this time, the summer of 2020. My colleagues sometimes refer to this as psychologists, the summer of anger, where we are starting to be real with our feelings. We're starting to not just see how stress is manifesting from our identities and our lived experiences, but we're also finding ways to express those feelings and to align with our colleagues around what it is we're experiencing. I also want to say I'm centering our experiences around living in the US, although that may not be everyone's current or historical experience. That's sort of the framework when I'm talking about stress. Much of the literature I'm citing and much of the research I'll be talking about really centralizes this conversation around living in the US. And then, as I mentioned, we'll talk about hopefully some useful coping skills that can be applicable to your journey as a transfer student, maintaining your resilience during tough times. So specifically talking about how we're going to be using our internal resilience to overcome the stressors we're seeing in 2020. And then we have access to this huge institution. So how do we navigate that institution, acknowledge the institution for its limitations, acknowledge this institution may not liberate me, but know that this institution is here with resources and is improving access to resources for us. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So this is the first breakout, actually. So I want to ask my moderators to prepare to have the first breakout. What I want to ask folks first, I've said a few things already. I've talked about racial tension. I've talked about the idea or the notion that COVID is not just sort of a biological consideration. It's not just a biological fear, but there are some additional ways in which COVID is impacting us perhaps differently. Something I didn't mention that I think is important is how is the media also impacting the way that we're learning about COVID, integrating information about COVID, and staying in touch or in tune with sort of the national statistics and national ways that COVID might be applicable to our lives. So I'll ask, so I'm going to stop. So here's the prompt, it's very general. I'm going to take myself out of screen share and ask folks for my moderators to go ahead and break out for 5 minutes to just address this question.
Confirming I'm opening rooms right now.
Awesome.
Okay, y'all, I'm a moderator, but I was recording the meeting. So, I guess this breakout room will be recorded, just a disclaimer. But I will pause it.
That and said my thing, it was like, oh shoot, it's done now. Like half the time is gone, but it went well. I liked it, and I'm really appreciative for everybody who did share.
Thanks, Carlos.
All right. So I'm going to share what I was hearing, and maybe this is going to be similar to what your groups talked about. I'm going to share some words that came up. Suckiest time, butchered, COVID butchered my social life, feelings of grief and loss. And something that I just want to name too is feeling like grieving for something you actually didn't get yet, right? So the expectation that you're going to be on campus, the expectation that you're going to be enrolled in classes and being there in person, the expectation that maybe your social life would be different, those were taken from you. So those expectations were sort of, as those dissolved, there's this sense of loss because you had sort of expected, you set up a preparedness for those things. So I think one of the things here that has helped me work on my grief and loss is how we have permission to grieve the things that we didn't have. So this could be, right, an expectation around campus, like being on campus or being in classes. It could also be an expectation around like maybe an internship or a position that was tied to being on campus, which, you know, impacts us financially, economically, and professionally. It could be due to your academic journey. Was the expectation that you would be at UCLA and there would be a next step? Is it applying for graduate school? Is it entering some kind of professional experience that had this timeline, and did COVID essentially disrupt that timeline? So all those things could be happening. And I think one of the ways we start to cope with this is to acknowledge and give permission for grieving those losses. I'm going to go back into the presentation here. So I really like to use kind of visuals and comics and different graphics to help me organize my mind around concepts. And this image showed up on Twitter, and I apologize, I don't have the original artist, and really resonated for me around this idea of the COVID loop, that there were times when I was really kind of focused on myself and my goals, and I felt sort of centered and calm. And there were times when I went into complete like a wildness, almost a panic. I panic shopped in the beginning for all sorts of things: toilet paper, hand sanitizer, a Nintendo Switch. I was like, I was like sort of in a strange, fugue trying to acquire. There was this sense of scarcity in relationship to COVID. And then at times we may loop or sort of transition into feelings of boredom, into feelings of mundaneness, that the everyday sort of seems to be the same Zoom screens, and there's this sort of repetitive, burdensome fatigue building, exhaustion, right? And that might happen frequently or intermittently in your experience. And then I think there's also, especially if you're carrying the identity of a student, there is this sense of needing to be productive, needing to be on top of your goals, needing to be addressing your major, addressing your timeline, making sure you're going to graduate on time. And I think all of those pressures push us to want to stay in a very organized routine. So the other thing I want to mention too is kind of this disequilibrium that we're, sort of navigating as well. The disequilibrium of getting messages, for instance, around business as usual versus we're in a crisis. The disequilibrium of care for yourself and also care for your community. And so hopefully that gives some wordings, some conceptual phrasing to some of the feelings you might have around constantly kind of like shifting or navigating your efforts and your mental states. So the other thing that's another way to organize our feelings right now comes from grief and loss literature and coping literature. And you may be familiar with the stages of grief. This is something that I think is kind of more known now in our popular media. But the psychological work that has expanded these theories really talk about the nonlinear way in which trauma response happens. And so I want to offer a lens of the trauma response to handling COVID. and understanding that we may be fluctuating across these different states as we're dealing with the pandemic, as we're dealing with the summer of anger, and allowing this theory to kind of help us center ourselves and name some of the things that we might be experiencing. I can share, for instance, that like the first, part of the pandemic, I was probably in a state of shock or surprise, that I was not necessarily, really understanding what was going on. There's an Instagram post that I often kind of go back and laugh at, because it's like a post of a picture of myself in Bradley Hall, and I'm like smiling, and in the caption it says something like, I'm going to be working from home for a week, last day in the office for a week. And I look at that and realize how I had such a like small understanding. Like little Boo didn't understand this was a 6 to 9 month, maybe even longer experience working from home, that my entire professional lifestyle would be upended. And the reason I look back on that often and chuckle at myself is that I thought I really had a grasp on my understanding of the pandemic, and it's really just kind of centered on my reactions to it. So I just want to offer the model for you to think about. Like, you might also be going through these different states of emotions, and as we look at this, there's sort of a positive ending to this, that as humans, we're very adaptable and we're very resilient, and we come to a place, hopefully, of some decision-making, experimentation, and thinking of adjusting our lifestyles to make this work for us. Integration is sort of the last piece of this trauma response model. How are we understanding our current capacities and experiences related to COVID, and how are we perhaps shifting ourselves into ways that that might help us thrive, that might help us be accessing our resilience and our ingenuity to make this experience work for us. And I'll talk a little bit more concretely about what some of those steps could look like. As a psychologist, I need to name that COVID is toxic to our mental health. Yes, COVID is this virus that we're managing our bodies, we're protecting our bodies from this virus. There's this invisible threat that is probably pervading our minds pretty routinely. But I also want to offer that COVID is toxic to our mental health, and these are just some reasons why that come from the coping literature. As we know, we have increased experiences of isolation. This may mean that you are connected to fewer people personally, that you might be not just physical distancing, but you may not be seeing members of your family as often. Your aunts and uncles, your cousins, various friends in your friendship circles. Somebody said earlier that their social life was just completely upended because of this, and that really resonated for me. The second piece that I think is fundamental here is the lack of control or feelings of uncertainty. COVID is unlike any other crisis as a community that we've experienced. When I was when 9/11 happened, I was in college. I was in upstate New York. So I wasn't in New York City. It was just a few hours away. And I think back to 9/11 actually pretty often, not just because we've had this 9/11 date come, the anniversary come by, but also because this crisis is having me ask myself how I tolerated and survived the last community crisis, the last community and global trauma really that we experienced. And I'm also thinking about the ways that they're different. COVID has no beginning, middle, and end. COVID is just COVID all the time. We have little sense of when this will come to a finality or when it will ease up. And so the uncertainty around the duration of COVID is particularly heavy on us psychologically. The uncertainty is also kind of this invisible threat. Especially early in the pandemic, the inability for us to fully grasp how this is transmitted. And so I think all the different ways that we've transformed our cultural and societal practices in relation to protecting our bodies has been sort of fixated on this threat. And I also want to add that, kind of to the point I was making before about thinking about COVID through a social lens, that our hyper awareness of our bodies, like when we're out maybe when we're grocery shopping or when we're at Target trying to buy toilet paper, we have been asked by the media, we've been asked by CDC to be fearful of other bodies. I mean, that's essentially how we keep our bodies safe. And I think for me, especially, I'm thinking about how that makes me hyper aware of what my body looks like. What is visible to other people about my body? Do they know that I'm a woman? Do they know that I'm an immigrant? Do they fear me because of my foreignness? What stereotype biases come to mind, or stereotype threats come to mind when I'm hyper vigilant about my body? And so this may come up certainly because of COVID, and it's also coming up in various ways as we talk about racial stress and racial trauma. And I think the other two are straightforward, right? We're sort of learning our capacity for our new technology, unfamiliar things. We're also experiencing a huge break in our rituals, the things that we normally took for granted, the things that kind of gave us that sense of calmness and that sense of comfort. Some of those things have been taken from us. I'm going to move forward here and talk a little bit about stress. It's important to kind of identify in your bodies what's happening just in terms of the different stress responses we might be happening. Acute stress, as you may know about, is kind of this shortened, sometimes unexpected stressful event. So an upcoming exam, even traumatic experiences like an assault, these are considered acute because they tend to be sort of eventful. It is something you can identify kind of in your timeline. Chronic stress is a little bit more difficult to wrap our heads around because it's a prolonged period of emotional burdensome stress, and it's exacerbated by certain aspects of our social and cultural experiences, like pervasive discrimination, community violence, exposure to media violence. And over the summer, this has been particularly impactful on us because we were watching again and again brutal violence against Black persons and people of color in our communities by the hands of police. So as those incidents and that exposure increased, our chronic stress continued to be prolonged. And I also say, like, we're basically dealing with both now. The chronic stress of the pandemic and ongoing racial tension and racial trauma continues to happen. But the acute stressors you still have exams, you still have the pressures of being a student, you still have your acute stressors as those continue to happen. So I just want to acknowledge that we're experiencing both at the same time. And so it's important that we manage that stress differently. I think the only thing I want to say here now is that the stress response can be useful for us. That I actually really love talking about stress in a weird way because it means that we're tuning into our bodies and our responses, our reactions, and we're thinking about how this stress can be converted to motivation and energy. And also it helps us know when the stress is not functional for us. We would call that distress, right? When we're feeling so much turmoil and pain that we need to kind of access outside resources or think about other scaffolded ways to preserve our bodies. And I think I've been getting at this idea, and I'm going to share a little bit of literature about this, but racism and discrimination fall under chronic stress, that we are not seeing an end to this continuous pressure that persons of color, that BIPOC communities have in this country. And the results, the different responses are plentiful, but include depression, anxiety, anger, post-traumatic responses, mistrust, fatigue, dissociation, and difficulty concentrating or focusing. And while I name some of these kind of more clinical terms, I want to avoid pathologizing very normal reactions, normal responses to racism and oppression. So it would be actually expected that our bodies and our brains have these responses to what I would consider, very not just brutal experiences, but ones that threaten our existence. Of course, we're going to have these kinds of normal reactions to extraordinary abhorrent experiences. The American Psychological Association over the summer did do some stress research to better understand how folks in the US were experiencing these particular moments of social and racial unrest. And one finding showed that, certainly in June, there was a particular spike in reports of discrimination, and as that being a source of significant stress. As a whole, the majority of Americans report that police violence in particular toward minority persons in this country was a source of significant stress. And, as I've been introducing the kind of commingling of COVID and racial tension, I think that hopefully this resonates for you as we think about these things intersecting and also impacting one another. I was citing the American Psychological Association a little earlier, and I just want to point out a couple things that psychologists center. They use a framework of addressing the social lens, because we really want folks to work on stress management. We want folks to understand their own responses, but I think it's important to frame this around a normalization of our stress responses. In particular, that stress is a consequence of these social forces around us, that stress isn't just kind of existing in isolation in our bodies, that we are responding to the social and cultural impacts, assaults, experiences. And we just need to acknowledge that, right? Racism and discrimination in particular have been shown to adversely affect the health and mental health of racial minorities in this country and increase risk for mental disorders. So I think that it's important to address where this comes from. And I think the other piece that is really important is that it is both real and perceived experiences of racism, oppression, and discrimination that adversely impact and create negative health outcomes for us. So this means that ambiguous situations or situations that may be indirect also impact our mental health. And more specifically then, witnessing video of oppression and brutality impacts our mental health. Being in a community where community members, folks who look like us, who share our culture, are being oppressed or brutalized can impact our mental health. And studies show time and time again, the stress levels of those who experience discrimination are higher for those who have fewer experiences of discrimination. So this has biological effects. This has physiological effects where you have a heightened stress response in our bodies. And it also leads to mental health impacts, negative coping or maladaptive coping, as well as higher levels of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic responses, and suicidality. So you can imagine that, this is a COVID conversation, because not only are our immune systems compromised, we're more vulnerable and susceptible to COVID, but it also means that we're going to see some we're going to see some gaps, some disparities between communities based on how COVID is intersecting with their identity. So, I said a lot there, and I want to have another opportunity to break out and ask a particular question here about your experiencing, your positioning here at the intersection of COVID and race. And so the prompt for our breakouts is this: how are racial inequalities or disparities showing up in your experience? So I'm going to give the moderators a chance. Really, a lot of really helpful reflections. I want to appreciate and just name that, as we're, as we've been spending some time together this hour, these questions have become increasingly challenging, right? But I just appreciate how the groups have been engaging in this conversation. Want to name a few things that I was hearing. So relatable, family downplaying the university experience, family downplaying your work ethic or your academic work. I heard that in our group. Some folks said they themselves noticed their own racial consciousness, that they were sort of becoming more conscious about racial divides in their community, kind of noticing things that they didn't notice before, what I call the matrix, like being a little bit more tuned into what the matrix is. Once you see it, you can't unsee the matrix. So I think it's sort of developmental and educational for us. Eye-opening is what somebody said. And I appreciate somebody sharing the sense of otherness. And I mean, I've in the last 6 months have been really hyper aware of otherness because of such frequent conversations about racial tension and race and ethnicity in our country. So I think there's a constant navigation of this, and people who have never talked to me about race are DMing me and sending me messages and texting me, and I'm like, this friend never asked me about my race, and now they're trying to apologize for things. So a lot to handle, a lot to hold, right? Let me get back into the PowerPoint here. Just a few more things I want to talk about, and then I know we need to wrap. So here's some positive things we can think about. Luckily, although research is still emerging around COVID, there are some ways that we can adapt during a crisis. And again, this comes from the coping literature in psychological work. So if you think about, what are the things we want to focus on in terms of COVID stressors? We want to achieve a sense of safety, find ways to be calm, engage in self-efficacy, stay connected with others, and maintain a sense of hopefulness. So how does this actually work in our virtual environments? How does this work in a place like UCLA? Well, for starters, I think one of the considerations should be your day-to-day health management. And I think some of this might be familiar to you, right? Establish a routine quickly, establish a routine every day. So have something around a comforting, comfortable routine. This means eating, exercising, and sleeping regularly. I think sleep gets underrated all the time, but sleep is actually such a reparative process neurobiologically, and is a stress reparative process. So it helps us process stress hormones. So sleep is probably the what I consider like the easiest thing that we can do for ourselves in our self-care. Taking frequent breaks is important. So between each of your classes, between each of your activities, have moments where you're not scrolling or doom scrolling your media or your news cycle. Take a moment to take breaks from your media experiences and your screen experiences to let the brain and body rest a little bit. And although it's more difficult now with fires in this state, with COVID, with limited all these restrictions on us, we still want to continue to have feel-good activities in our day-to-day experiences, whether this is a phone call, watching your favorite show, going for a walk, something that traditionally for you offers you a feeling of joy. I mentioned this already, but I think one of the lowest hanging fruit here around our self-care is centered around how much sleep we get. Hopefully at night, but some people have different sleep cycles. So what I often say is, as long as you're getting at least 7 hours of sleep in your cycle, this is going to improve your focus and your sense of concentration during the day. So a myth I just want to address as we get toward the last section here. I think especially for students who might share particular identities, transfer students, first-gen students, often we have a narrative of being stressed. Being stressed is how I got here. I had to kind of hold on to my stress, cling on to stress in order to know I'm working hard. I have a hardworking ethic. I'm doing the work I need to achieve my excellence, to achieve my goals. So I think there's a narrative of stress that we've kind of adopted. Many of us have almost enmeshed with stress because we feel that is what helps us achieve and advance. But I want to assure you around the idea that rest is necessary not just for healing, but to achieve your academic excellence. That rest is necessary not just in terms of sleep, but also just in terms of slowing your body and being still and stepping away sometimes from media cycles, stepping away from racial tension, stepping away from the violence that we're constantly going to see. Rest is necessary for healing as it relates to some of the identities that I mentioned, that the hard work and the hustle is inherently tied into the way we were raised, maybe how we were acculturated, or maybe some of the ideals or ideas that we've adopted. And rest is necessary for a restorative process. So some quick tips here on I mentioned calmness as one of the things that we need as a strategy. there are two mindful, sort of mental strategies that we can offer you. And this actually comes from the Happiness Lab at Yale. The first one is the psychological distancing. We know about physical distancing during COVID, and I think we've got that down. Psychological distancing is sort of a mental trick or a mental state of mind where we're kind of addressing we're addressing ourselves in third person. And so it's this sense of taking a step back and thinking about ourselves in order to improve our self-efficacy skills. So I think about this sort of like when I'm advising a student, or sometimes I think about this when a friend is asking me for help. I might be really like skillful when I'm offering someone else advice. Like I can think of 10 different things to help someone with if they're telling me they're unmotivated or they're feeling really stressed out. When it's me, you're too much in your feels, and sometimes, we are not able to access the skills around problem solving, around future orientation, around some of that planful stuff, all the juicy good stuff that we offer to other people. Think about turning that inward. That's what psychological distancing means. If you've ever heard LeBron talk about himself in third person, I mean, this is kind of what it's about. It's like taking a step back and telling yourself, coaching yourself around your abilities. Temporal distancing is a little bit different. It's kind of what I did before when I talked about 9/11. Something in my past might help me in my future or in my present sense. So I think about like, during 9/11, what were the resilience skills that I used to get me through those moments? What helped me get through those tough times? And how can I access those experiences or those resources now in this current crisis? I'm just actually going to skip through this activity and talk about this strategy here around gaining control. So I mentioned one of the other strategies for coping during COVID is gaining a sense of control. And I think right now it's really hard to kind of place ourselves in a good understanding of what it means to gain control, because there's so much helplessness. There's so many things that we do not have control over. So this literature comes from liberation psychology work. It comes from the coping research that specifically looks at BIPOC communities in the US and how we're handling particular stressors and how we can kind of strategize our coping within ourselves. And I find this to be a really good shortcut to kind of take moments when I'm feeling stressed and just kind of go through this process. And this process can only take a few minutes. The first piece is to calculate. So how big is the stress? What am I actually experiencing? There's no toilet paper in the stores, which was one of the first kind of like scarcity stressors we experienced, or is this bigger than that? So first calculate how big this stress is. Locate in your body where you're feeling this stress. Are you feeling it in your heart? Are you feeling like rapid heartbeat? Are you feeling panicked? Are you feeling it all over, sort of a chronic heaviness in your muscles? Are you feeling it? I often feel kind of almost like a disorganized kind of stress up in my brain, like either an actual headache or just sort of a fogginess. And then communicate to yourself. This is that coaching part. So what self-talk is helpful to you now? And I gave an example here on the slide. Often we feel a stuckness or we feel a helplessness in our positioning. And sometimes we just need to shift our own narrative. So for instance, instead of asking, when will I be released from this? When will this end for me? Why is this happening to me? Instead go to, what am I going to do about this right now? Or what is the first thing I need to do to get unstuck? Or sometimes, we were talking about watching very, very, very difficult shows, very provocative shows that are about race and gender and our current society. And sometimes the question is, what am I learning from this? What is this teaching me? What can I get from that? And then, of course, regulate your body, right? So take a moment, whether it's closing your eyes and meditating, whether it's breathing deeply. And this means you have to push away from all the distractions in front of you. Okay, so and we just have a few more minutes, so I'm going to skip the last breakout and just kind of wrap with the last few ideas here about resilience. And this is sort of the core of this conversation that we're having now, because we sort of started with what are the stressors we have. We've acknowledged that COVID has introduced a number of uncertain things and a number of new stressors. And also in our last breakout, we talked about a very sort of eye-opening experience about our racial identities and how many of us are kind of managing and positioning ourselves differently as we're exposed to racial trauma, and also navigating racial trauma among ourselves and our communities. So a lot of this resilience work comes from the not just psychology research, but also from activists. So Tarana Burke, for instance, some of the Me Too activists. And this resilience work really looks at kind of looking at your own capacity, recognizing in yourself like what you already are equipped to do, recognizing that your struggle is valid, realizing how you might already be resilient, and kind of thinking about where that resilience comes from. And I think that's really tied to our identity. The news about about UCLA being the #1 institution, public institution in the US, was so exciting. And I also thought, we have so many new Bruins who don't get to come to UCLA at this time. And I think about kind of the nuances, the disequilibrium, like what a celebratory feeling coping around both. And can you be excited to be a part of the Bruin community, the #1 public institution, and also be disappointed appropriately that you can't be on campus right now to form community with one another. I'm gonna share this with the moderators so that you have all these slides. But I think I just want to kind of focus here on this point about resiliency, and what I hope to end with is that there are some things that we can do, which you have the internal capacity for. And then of course, this institution has some resources that you can access that are available to everybody. So this idea of self-empowerment, self-compassion, and self-efficacy are really kind of the 3 components of resiliency. And it comes from this idea of like, you know, there's that like getting into your work, like just hustling, that's the self-empowerment, right? The self-compassion is the kindness that you give to yourself. You might make mistakes. You might feel your feelings. Give yourself permission to feel those feelings, right? Locate yourself. As we mentioned, we're talking about how we're all being impacted, our positionality here. Locate yourself and give yourself permission to feel what you feel about that location. Self-efficacy then, of course, is how we're continuing to stay hopeful and how we're continuing to look at our internal ways to achieve our goals and to continue to stay focused on our goals. So I'm going to skip down to our resources here. CAPS, of course, is your, as I mentioned, your counseling and psychological services office. The location is actually closed at this time during COVID, but they will be offering remote services, and you do not have to be in the state of California to receive CAPS services. There are some ways in which CAPS can continue to consult with you and provide you the care that you might need. So I urge people to contact CAPS even if they're not in the state of California. Similar with RISE, this is our Resilience Center. RISE offers a hub virtually now of wellness, self-care, and resilient activities and workshops for students interested in just improving their day-to-day well-being, their mental well-being in particular. So there's lots of offerings there. There's pre-recorded offerings as well as workshops that will be available throughout the quarter. So I urge folks to check out our Instagram page and to go to risecenter.ucla.edu. So I'm going to just take a moment to get out of sharing my screen because I know it's 11:31 and we need to wrap. So with that, I think in ending with RISE, that might be the perfect way to invite you to continue to stay connected with the RISE Center, either through me or through the website portal. Thanks, Sarah, for linking us in the chat there. And if you have any questions about this workshop, I'm happy to share with you the literature, the slides, or any of the references that came up today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this presentation. We really, really appreciate it. All the information that you gave was super vital and really, really important, especially with these times. So I just want to thank you for getting and doing this presentation. And we'll be reaching out to you shortly, like with another thank you for everything you're doing.
Yeah, just to echo what Carlos said, thank you again. The whole purpose is that we really want to normalize the idea that it's okay to feel bad and it's okay to like process these difficult emotions. It's really hard because like, you know, some people might think like, oh, you know, some people are doing it well and then there's me with all my emotions, and it's okay to feel that. It's okay to kind of work on yourself, because it's very crucial that like you take a moment and like look at yourself. That's what we encourage for everyone who's watching this and everyone who came here to do, is always monitor yourself, because it's you're the most important person to yourself at the end of the day. So again, thank you, Dr. Lenamendi, for giving this wonderful presentation.
Thanks so much for that. Everyone, I hope you take good care of yourselves, and please reach out if you need anything.